3, 2, 1, now.
That audio came from the BBC-produced Noel Edmonds Concorde special. The voice, of course, is that of the one and only John Hutchinson, and he's back with us today for episode number 3 of Concorde Week here on Podcasting on a Plane. I'm Brandon Gonzalez. Thank you for joining us again. And in the last 2 episodes, we learned what it took to get selected to fly Concorde, what training was like and why, how he narrowly escaped an aircraft fire at Heathrow, and what it was like flying corporate in England in the 60s. Today, in our second to last episode, John becomes a BBC correspondent. He becomes known to the royal family, and out of all the rich and famous and powerful people he flew across the pond in his 15-year Concorde Captaincy, John has one who stands out to this day, and he tells us who it is.
I was due to operate a flight, a scheduled service. I suppose it must have been in the mid-80s. Around 1984, something like that. I was operating this scheduled service to New York, and the BBC were broadcasting a Battle of Britain air show at a place called Royal Air Force St Athan, which is on the south coast of Wales, and that was right under the track of Concorde as it headed westwards out of Heathrow on its way to New York. And they called up British Airways 2 or 3 days before I was due to do this flight and said, look, we're doing this air show. Is there any chance that the captain, whoever he may be, who's operating that flight on the Sunday, could he do a transmission from the flight deck to the crowd at the Battle of Britain air show as he flies overhead St Athan? British Airways called me up and said, would I do it? And I said, yes, of course I would. So what we actually did on the day, we got airborne from Heathrow. We climbed up to about, I can't remember, flight level 150, something like that, and cruised along at a relatively low level. And then as we approached St Athan, I got clearance to descend under radar. And remember, this is a scheduled flight with a whole load of passengers on board. And we descended to 6,000 feet and flew right over the top of St Athan. And they got a lovely picture of me tracking over the airfield on my way westwards. And as I went over the top, I said something like, what a privilege it was to be talking to everybody today, and I would like everybody to remember that we enjoy our freedoms today thanks to those people who laid down their lives in the Battle of Britain. I said something like that. And then I sort of said, I hope you all have a wonderful day at your Battle of Britain air show at St Athan. I wish you Godspeed, and I'll now continue on my way to New York. Farewell. And we carried on to New York, and that was that. Well, then, as soon as I got back home, the BBC producer who was in charge of that program rang me up and said, look, he said, could you come up to the BBC and have a chat with us, because I think you've got a wonderful voice for broadcasting and we'd like to use you. So I went up and saw them, and that's how it all happened, basically. So it was pure accident that it happened, and it led to some fascinating opportunities. And British Airways, of course, were delighted because I was promoting Concorde, promoting British Airways, and they were just thrilled to bits with the whole thing and backed me up all the way with that. So it was a very, very sort of happy turn of events, actually. BBC had obviously done a lot of filming from Concorde, on Concorde, of Concorde over the years, and I had been very much a sort of central sort of feature in all that. And then one day they approached me and they said, it'd be really great if we could actually film a complete trip all the way from Heathrow either to New York or to Washington. And I said, well, it'd probably be easier to do it to Washington because it tended to have fewer passengers than the New York run did, and therefore it wouldn't be quite so disrupting for the passengers. And British Airways agreed to all this. And what the BBC actually did for that program was fantastic. I mean, the quality of the filming on that production was just terrific. First of all, they installed a miniature camera, a mini cam, in the windshield, and that sequence, for instance, of the takeoff out of Heathrow, which is, I think, absolutely terrific. That was all filmed by that mini cam looking out from the windshield, with a better view out of the windshield than the pilots actually enjoyed. So they had that camera there. They had another camera fitted on a telescopic strut that went from the floor of the flight deck to the roof of the flight deck, so that it became, if you like, a sort of integral part of the airplane almost, with a camera clamped onto that telescopic strut. And they had another mobile camera, a handheld camera, at the back on one of the jump seats with a cameraman operating it. So we had 3 cameras on board. Oh, and they also had a camera, no, 4 cameras, because they had another camera that sort of looked back at us, the crew members, so that you could see me or the first officer or the flight engineer sitting there in our seats. So it really was cameraed up in every way you can think of. And they stayed on board for the whole of the flight out to Washington. And the film was called, well, probably in the United States you may not have heard of him, but a very well-known broadcaster. And he's still broadcasting to this day, as a chap called Noel Edmonds, a very nice man, a very professional broadcaster, I may say, who was extremely helpful with me and gave me a lot of sort of training, if you like. And the program is called the Noel Edmonds Concorde Special, and he was the sort of host of the program, with me and my flight crew as the sort of the centerpiece of it all. So that's basically how that program came about. Yeah, I'm not going to tell you the story about Elvis Costello, not for your podcast, because it requires the use of a very colourful Anglo-Saxon word beginning with F, and you have to use that. You have to use that word for the thing to be funny, for the story to be funny. Otherwise, it's sort of pointless. So I think we'd best avoid that one. I did have an amusing incident, really, coming out of New York to London, and we're about an hour and a quarter or so out of London. And the chief steward comes up and he says, "Captain, I got a bit of a problem." And I said, "What's the problem?" And he said, "There's a couple in the forward toilet doing thingy." And I said, "What do you mean they're doing thingy?" He said, "Well, they're having sex in the toilet." And I said, "Really?" I said, "How do you know they're having sex?" And he said, "Well, I can tell from the sound effects." So I said, "Well, is this presenting you with a great problem? Is there a huge queue of people wanting to use the toilet?" And he said, "No." So I said, "Well, in that case," I said, "leave them to it, leave them in peace. When they come out, present them each with a bottle of champagne, with my compliments and with the compliments of British Airways." And I may say it was decent champagne. It was Dom Perignon. "And ask the lady if she'd like to come and watch the landing into London." Anyway, they duly completed their sex act, and I have to tell you that to be having sex in a Concorde toilet is worthy of some sort of recognition from the International Olympic Committee, because anybody Anybody who's been on a Concorde loo will know that there's not a lot of space in there. So you've really got to be a bit double jointed, I think, to be doing things like that in the Concorde toilet. Anyway, they duly came out with silly grins on their faces, and they were each presented with their bottle of Dom Perignon. And the lady was asked if she'd like to watch the landing into London, and she said, "Oh, I'd love to." And up she comes onto the flight deck, and I turned round and I said, "Good evening, madam. I do hope you're enjoying your flight with us this evening." And she looked at me with a broad grin on her face, and she said, "Gee, Captain," she said, "it's the greatest ride I've ever had." And she knew that I knew, and I knew that she knew that I knew. Anyway, she sat there and watched the landing, and they duly got off, she and this chap with their bottles of champagne. I got onto the crew bus, and I said to the chief steward, "Oh, I've never had anything like that happen before on an aeroplane." And he said, "Well," you said, "you don't know the best bit." He said, so I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Well," he said, "they'd never met each other before." I said, "Really?" He said, No. He said she'd checked in 2 or 3 hours before the flight and had been in the departure lounge and had enjoyed the liquid refreshments as well as the lovely small eats and things they have in the Concorde departure lounge. And he was a businessman, last minute gate check-in, who'd literally run to the airplane to catch on the airplane. I don't think he even showed his boarding card when he boarded. He was all hot and flustered, and we'd actually held our position on the gate waiting for him to arrive. And he got on board, the door was shut, the gate retracted itself, and we were pushing back. And he just went back into the cabin and just found the first empty seat, plonked himself down there, found himself sitting next to this very attractive lady. And they obviously had a few drinks before lunch, and followed by a few drinks after the meal, and then they decided to go and celebrate, which they did to great effect. And they went off with a bottle of champagne each. So I guess they had a good day, really. So there we are. Concorde could have all these sort of strange effects on people, you could say. Another story about Concorde, which has nothing to do with the flight, was it was a birthday party I went to in the summer of 1985 at a place called St. Paul's, Walden. And the birthday party was for Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Now, her family name was Bowes-Larn, and the Bowes-Larn family estate was at this little village called St. Paul's, Walden in Hertfordshire, not very far from where I live, actually. And it was a glorious summer's afternoon, about 400 people there. And during the course of the afternoon, this chap comes up to me and he said, "Excuse me," he said, "are you one of the Concorde pilots?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm a Concorde pilot, yes." And he said, "Could you just stay here? Her Majesty the Queen Mother would like to have a word with you." So I sort of stood rooted to the spot, waited for the Queen Mother to arrive. And she came up to me and she said, "Oh," she said, "you're a Concorde pilot." And I said, "Yes, ma'am, I am." And she said, "I love that airplane so much." And she said, "I'm so proud of it." And she said, "I'm so pleased that we've built a supersonic airliner and the Americans haven't got one." She never mentioned the French, and I didn't think I'd mentioned the French either. They did, of course, have a lot to do with it as well. But anyway, she didn't mention them. And she went on in this vein, and she said, "Oh," she said, "that nice Mr. King, I mean Lord King, gave me a lovely birthday present of a flight on Concorde over my Scottish estates and down the North Sea." And I said, "Yes, ma'am, I knew about that." And she said, "Were you one of the crew?" I said, "No, I'm sorry. I was killed in the rush." And she fell about laughing. And then she said, "You do know that if you're landing on one of the runways at Heathrow, there's one that you fly right past my London home." And I said, "Yes, ma'am, I was aware of the fact that I sometimes flew right past her London home, Clarence House." And she said, "Well," she said, "if you're ever on that runway and the weather's good and I can see the airplanes coming into land. He said, I always come to the window. It's about time for my first gin and tonic of the evening. And I waved to you. And I looked at her in absolute astonishment and I said, you don't really, do you? And she said, absolutely. She said, I just love Concorde so much. And I said, look, ma'am, I tell you what I'll do from now on. If I'm ever landing on that runway and if the weather's clear, I'll waggle my wings and flash my landing lights at you. And she said, will you? And I said, yes, absolutely, I certainly will. So you must look out for me. And from that point on, whenever I was on runway 28 left, and if the weather was good, as I say, if I could see Clarence House, I'd waggle my wings, I'd make an announcement to the passengers and say, I'm terribly sorry. By royal command, I've got to waggle the wings as we go past the Queen Mother's residence. And I'd flash my landing lights at her. And to my eternal regret, I never, ever wrote to her to ask her if she'd seen me do this. So I don't know and will now never know whether or not she ever saw it. But I suspect she did, and I suspect there she was waving back at me. I'd like to think so anyway. That's to my mind, a lovely little story about a member of the royal family.
October 2003, so just 15 years ago, almost exactly to the day as I'm recording this. That was the day of those last flights into Heathrow. And the BBC had rigged up a commentary booth at the maintenance base, the engineering base at Heathrow. And Raymond Baxter and I were sitting there with a BBC presenter, professional presenter, and we were sort of commentating, if you like, on the three Concordes coming in one after the other at sort of 1 minute intervals. And you could see them all lined up on final approach, one in the front and the one number 2 and then number 3. Incredible sight to see three Concordes coming in line astern, one after the other, at sort of minute and a half intervals for landing. It was quite extraordinary and very, very emotional. And I'm told by people who watch that television coverage of those last flights that Raymond Baxter and I, we didn't need to say anything. Our body language said it all. A sort of body language of gloom and unutterable depression. And it should never have ended that way. But there we are. Life goes on. And thanks to Concorde, I've had the most wonderful retirement. I do a lot of lecturing about Concorde all around the UK, all around the world. I've lectured at Embry-Riddle University in Arizona, near Phoenix. I've lectured in Australia, I've lectured in Hong Kong, I've lectured in New Zealand, I've lectured in France. I've actually talked about the Air France Concorde crash twice in France, once at a French aviation conference, and once to a group of European airline pilots in Nice. So I've talked about Concorde in general and the Air France crash in particular all around the world. And it's given me a sort of whole new career in a sense. And what is actually amazing is that I always assumed that people would forget about Concorde and it would just be consigned to the dustbin of history. Far from it. The interest in the airplane now is almost greater than it was when it was still flying. And I get the most amazing audiences at my talks. And it's not because I'm a great public speaker, although I can talk about Concorde with a considerable amount of passion. it's because people are interested in the airplane and fascinated by the airplane. It's as though it's become, oh, I don't know, like some sort of mythical creature that existed once upon a time, like the dragon or the unicorn. And it's something because it's so beautiful and because it had such an performance. And there's something absolutely timeless about the shape of the airplane. And I am quite sure, I mean, you look at cars of the era when Concorde came into being, and they look incredibly dated. You look at Concorde, it doesn't look dated at all. And I think 100 years from now, Concorde will still look a symbol of absolute beauty and elegance. And it's a timeless shape. It's the most perfect piece of engineering and technology. I think it was a chap called Sir Hugh Casson in Britain, who was an architect, who once described Concorde as a piece of 20th century sculpture. And I think that defines the airplane beautifully, because it really was a fusion of art and technology into one sublime and iconic creation. It was just a beautiful airplane. Anyway, thank you, Concorde. You've given me another career in my retirement, and I'm still lecturing all over the place and lecturing on cruise ships, so I'm having a great time. And one of the embarrassing things is that on cruise ships, I've had on many, many occasions people coming up to me and saying, you should write a book. And I've always said, no, I'll never write a book. I couldn't get around to it. Too embarrassing for words. Anyway, one day I was approached by an authoress who lives in the UK called Susan Ottaway, who's a very distinguished authoress. I mean, she's written books about Guy Gibson, the dam busters pilot in the Second World War for the RAF dam busters raid. She's written books about the history of British South American Airways and all sorts of different books. And she'd been to see me about a book she was writing. And as she was leaving, she said to me, you should write a book. And I said, no. People on cruise ships keep telling me I should, but I'm certainly not going to. I couldn't be bothered. And she said, well, we'll ghostwrite it. I'll ghostwrite it for you. I said, no, absolutely not. I think that's a complete cheat, sort of pretending that you wrote it when somebody else actually did the writing. And she said, well, I could write it as a biography. I said, no, honestly, Susan, I don't want a book written about me. I've got nothing interesting to tell you anyway. And she said, nonsense. You know, if that's the way you feel about it, that's the way it'll have to be left. Anyway, the next cruise I went on, lots of passengers kept coming up to me and saying, why don't you write a book? Why don't you write a book? And finally I succumbed and I said to Sue, how do you feel about it? Sue being my wife, by the way. And she said, well, I don't really like the idea. I said, nor do I. But I said, we keep getting these people saying that I should write a book. Anyway, cut a long story short, I got in touch with Susan Ottaway and I said, were you serious about writing a biography? And she said, absolutely I was. So I said, well, I'll tell you what, if you are serious about it, I'll authorize you to do it. And she spent about 18 months of her life doing a hell of a lot of research. I found out things about my childhood that I didn't know. I was actually born in India, and she did a whole lot of research into my life in India. I don't know where earth she found things from. But anyway, she's written this book, which, by the way, I have never read because I simply couldn't bring myself to read a life story about my own life. My wife, Sue, did proofread it. I have never read it apart from the chapter on the Air France Concorde crash. And I did read that because I wanted to make sure that all the technical details were accurate and correct. The book is available on Amazon if anybody wants to read it. I'm told it's a fantastically good read. If you look at it on Amazon, you'll see it's had tremendous sort of 4-star, 5-star ratings. She's a very good author, I know that. And the book is called The Wind Beneath My Wings. The Wind Beneath My Wings by Susan Ottaway. And if you're ever in UK and you've got a copy of that, you can try getting in touch with me and I'll very happily sign the book for you. I mean, I'll just throw in that, flying Concorde for 15 years as I did was the most enormous privilege of my flying life. I am so lucky that I was on that airplane for such a long time. I got about 6,000 flying hours on Concorde, and what does amuse me a great deal is that about 3,900 of those flying hours are supersonic flight time. I used to keep a column in my logbook, and every time I went through Mach 1 accelerating, I'd make a note of the time. And then as I decelerated back through Mach 1 to subsonic speeds, I'd make a note of that time, and I'd log that time interval in my logbook. And as I say, I've got about, I think it's 3,950 supersonic flight hours. And I love telling my Air Force fighter pilot friends that, because they can count their supersonic flight time in a matter of minutes. And the other great privilege of flying the airplane, of course, and all the time I flew it, you must remember that we used to keep open flight deck doors. This was before 9/11. I retired in 1992, so I've been retired for 26 and a bit years now. So I've got used to retirement. The business of locked flight deck doors came about as a result of 9/11. All the time I was flying, used to keep open flight deck doors in British Airways. And on Concorde, we always used to say to passengers, you come up and see us. For us to go down and see them and ask them if they had any complaints about the flight or any problems at all, that was considered to be a pestilential nuisance by the cabin crew because we got in the way of the cabin service. So we used to stay firmly up on the flight deck, and passengers could wander up onto the flight deck whenever they felt like it and come and visit us. So by definition, almost, Concorde being what it was, carried all sorts of very famous names. And, just as a sort of sampling, I mean, I've carried people like Elvis Costello regularly, Paul McCartney regularly. I carried John Denver many times. I've carried all the great classical musicians, and people who spring to mind right now are Yitzhak Perlman, Isaac Stern, Pinky Zuckerman, all these people. Not to mention diplomats. I've flown Henry Kissinger a lot. I've flown politicians, diplomats, actors, actresses. It was just a litany of the famous and the powerful. And to meet these people and to be able to talk to them and have the privilege of talking to them was certainly one of the great privileges of flying Concorde. And I think if I was to single out a particular person that will always remain firmly in my mind, that was carrying Muhammad Ali from New York to London, and he came up and spent quite a lot of time on the flight deck and watched the landing into London. And I guess this must have been about, 1978, 79. And he was just, well, the only way I can describe him was he was a magnificent looking specimen of humanity. But he wasn't just a magnificent looking person. He had a great sense of humor, and he was just a really nice person and a most enjoyable person to have been able to talk to. So that is one person that really sticks in my mind as a very special man who I feel incredibly privileged to have met. So there again, I thank Concorde yet again for opening all those doors for me and giving me all these huge opportunities in life.
Well, I think it's safe to say that I am a little envious. John's career is pretty much a play-by-play of dream gigs for me, one after another, and I'm so glad to be able to share all of this with you. But don't worry, we're not done yet. Tomorrow, it's our last and final episode of Concorde Week, and John's going to tell us the story we all think we know, but probably don't. And that's the story of Air France Flight 4590. That's right, the Concorde that crashed, more or less signaling the end of the program. But it didn't happen like we all think. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's story is one you won't want to miss.